Hello everyone, my name is William, aka the Swedish Polyglot, and in this video I will be talking about the idea of adding or attaching hypotheses to our goals. Now in the last video I talked about SMART goals, the idea that we want our goals to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time constrained. And the reason for this I covered in my last video, so if you want to see that video before you watch this video, you can check it out over here. In this video I will add an additional principle to this standard model of goal setting. For people who've had any contact with science whatsoever, they might have heard of the idea of an hypothesis. And an hypothesis is basically that we, at least in the context of goal setting here, is that let's say we have a goal. So the goal might be listen to 180 hours of Japanese in 2 months, for example. So adding an hypothesis to this, an example could be, okay, so after having listened to Japanese for a total of 180 hours during the course of 2 months, I believe my listening comprehension will be at an intermediate level. And you can define that subjectively, basically understanding most things in an average setting, in a conversational setting, in a general media setting. But anyway, so I've added an hypothesis here. And so what's the benefit? What's the purpose of adding an hypothesis? Yes, so the purpose is basically that if we continually set goals and attach hypotheses to our goals, over time, as we go through the process of testing these hypotheses, our knowledge of what sort of activity in a language leads to what sort of outcome will improve. And that will allow us to, in future goal setting scenarios, we will be able to predict more or less how much activity and what sort of activity we need to get to a certain level in a language. So I will give a few examples here from my own personal language learning. So I think it was last year, I ran a few experiments. I got my French, my Italian, and German comprehension to an intermediate level. So I ran 3 experiments with 3 different hypotheses, basically. And the first hypothesis or goal was, I'm gonna listen to French for 1 hour a day and look up 100 words per day for roughly 3 months. And that totaled around 100 hours of listening and 10,000 words looked up. Okay, so I used a website, it's called Link. And I use Link because you can track different variables, like hours of listening, how many words you've looked up. So I used this website and that got me to an intermediate level, more or less, of listening comprehension and reading comprehension, right? So that gave me some knowledge of what sort of activity I might need in a language such as French at the current state that I was in at that time, having learned the languages that I had previously learned. I had Portuguese and Spanish, and then English and Swedish as my native languages. So the next experiment was German. And this time my hypothesis was, okay, I'm going to take the same amount of activity, 100 hours of listening, and coupled with looking up 10,000 words on this website while reading. But this time I compressed that activity from 3 months to 1 month. And I had the same hypothesis, but changing one variable, which is the time. So instead of 100 words looked up per day, I did 334, and I listened for 3 hours a day to German. Keep in mind, this listening is passive, it's not active. I'm not doing it in a single tasking type of way. I'm doing it while I'm cleaning, while I'm maybe driving, while I'm cooking, even sometimes when I play video games and during other activities. Right, and it more or less confirmed my hypothesis there as well. I managed to get to more or less an intermediate level in terms of I could watch Netflix, maybe with German subtitles. And so that gave me some more data, right? So I didn't really get to the same level in German as I did in French. And I think that led me to 2 conclusions. Right, so hypotheses, if we test them, it might lead us to discover things, make conclusions, and then improve our language learning during the course of testing these hypotheses. So that's a benefit. In the case of German here, my 2 conclusions were, 1, I probably did not achieve the same level of comprehension, passive vocabulary, listening comprehension, due to 1, I believe my previous languages that I had acquired did not help me as much in German as it had helped me in French. Now, I do speak Swedish, it's my native tongue or native language, and it's quite similar to German, but there's still lots of vocabulary that didn't transfer that well, that I couldn't recognize right off the bat. So that was one conclusion. The other one was that I was listening 3 hours a day. So when I listened for 1 hour a day, that listening was more active I paid more attention per hour of listening. Well, because I listened 3 hours a day, I had to really squeeze that in. I had to layer it with activities that I did not really have to do in French. So maybe I was listening while playing video games and stuff like that. So the quality of attention there was lower. So I think per hour of listening, the return on investment was lower for my German experiment. Right, but I learned a few things, right? And that can help me to predict, for example, if I were to learn Dutch or something, a similar language to German, more or less how much activity. I might need to bump it up to maybe 15,000 words looked up or 200 hours of listening or something like that, just an example. And then my third experiment was Italian. And then I ran the same hypothesis there. For 30 days, I was gonna look up 334 words. That took me about an hour, both in German and Italian. For several reasons, I did it quite passively. I wasn't really reading the full text. I was basically just clicking the words I did not understand. While I was reading French, I was basically reading the whole thing. So I spent the same amount of time. It was just that I looked up words in a different way, and that might have contributed to me getting to a lower level in German as well, probably. But I ran the same experiment for Italian. For Italian, I actually cut the experiment short after maybe 20 days or 3 weeks, because I had already achieved like an intermediate level of comprehension after just 3 weeks. So maybe 60 hours of listening and I think around 6,000 words looked up or something like that. And my conclusion was simply that I had so much infrastructure in similar languages, French, Portuguese, Spanish, that the activity I needed to acquire Italian was basically less. It's called a positive transfer, what you get from previous learning experiences and how that carries over to other learning experiences after that. Okay, so that was my personal experience of hypotheses and why they can help you, because you're going out there as a scientist, more or less. You're testing your own ideas. You're testing to see what variables lead to what outcomes, right? I think that was it for this video. Thanks for listening. And if you're like me, interested in the topics of language learning and ideas, then you might be interested in subscribing to my channel. And if you have similar experiences with setting hypotheses or goal setting in language learning, or if you would add additional principles apart from the smart, measurable, attainable, relevant, time constrained, and also what I talked about in this video, adding hypotheses. If you have other principles that you personally would add to the process of maybe goal setting and so on in your language learning, leave a comment down below and I'd be glad to hear about your perspective. Okay, thanks for listening and see you in the next video.